Hello everyone. In today's video, we'll be learning about stakeholders. Now, the first thing what we need to understand is what are stakeholders. Now, stakeholder can be an individual or a group of individual who has an interest in what the organization does. So they are interested in the activities of the organization or who affects or can be affected by the organization action. So either can affect the organization actions, can affect the organization actions or can be affected by them. Now, for example, if the organization is looking for a loan and has approached a bank, the loan purpose is to fund the company's operations. Now, for example, if the bank rejects the loan application, you can see that the bank has an impact on the organization in terms of the organization will be having difficulty in terms of running the business, the purpose. On the other hand, for example, organization provides services and products to its customers. Okay, so we are dependent on the organization to provide us with a service or with a specific product. Now, if the organization is not making that product or service, ultimately it will have an impact on the consumers. So, if you see, the main essence of this definition is that there is a bi-directional relationship. Organizations can affect the stakeholders, and stakeholders, on the other hand, can also affect the organization. Now, moving further, we need to understand that how we can classify stakeholders. There are two ways for now. The first one is either you say that the stakeholders are internal, connected, or external, or you can say that the stakeholders can be primary ones and secondary ones. Now, when you talk about internal, connected, or external, internal stakeholders are those which are working for the organization, basically the employees, the management, the board of directors, all of them are considered to be as the internal stakeholders because they are working for the organization and within the organization. Next, we have connected stakeholders. These individuals or stakeholders have invested their money in the organization. So it could be the investors, it could be the fund providers, the finance providers, the bank, for instance, or it could be the customers who are paying to get a product or a service, or it could also be the suppliers who are providing you with the raw materials and with their services so that the company or the organization make the final output. Moving further, we have the external stakeholders now. These stakeholders are neither working for the organization or have any investment in the organization. They don't have any financial link with the organization. So those are considered to be as your external stakeholders. For instance, your government. Government is not working within the organization. They have not invested in the organization. So in that case, it's considered to be as an external stakeholder. But in case if the government invests in the organization, then it will be definitely be considered to be as a connected stakeholder. So you cannot make up a hard and fast rule. There is a sense of subjectivity over here, and you need to understand that what is the purpose of that specific stakeholder, and on that basis you can classify them. So here we have a summary of the different types of stakeholder. Internal, directors, managers, and employees. Connected could be your shareholders, trade contacts like customers, suppliers, your advisors, your competitors. External could be your government, your media. Media can have an impact on your publicity or can impact on your reputation. Pressure groups, like for instance your environmental pressure groups, they are interested that how friendly your environmental policies are. And local community, for example, if the organization is affecting the environment, the natural environment, so the local community will also be interested as into how the organization is treating the natural environment. Now, a second way of classifying the stakeholders was primary or secondary. If you talk about primary stakeholders, they have a contractual relationship with the company. So before they make up a relationship with the organization, they have a contractual thing, a legal contract. So if you are working for an organization, you have a contract, you have your employment contract. So it's a contractual relationship with the organization. If you are investing in the company, you do have a contract. If you are providing goods and services to the organization, as in your supplier, you do have a contract. So basically, the internal and connected stakeholders together, we classify them as primary stakeholders. And in all of those cases, you do have a contractual relationship with the company. Secondary stakeholders are those that don't have a contractual relationship with the company, and basically they are your external stakeholders. So the government doesn't have any contractual relationship with the organization. Hence, we consider them to be as your secondary stakeholder. Now, there is a conflict between stakeholders, okay, because every stakeholder will have a different claim or need from the organization, and it's most likely that these claims and needs will be in conflict, and the management of that organization would have to manage them properly. Now, for example, you have customers who have a claim from the organization that they want value for money product or service. They don't want to pay too much, but on the other hand, they also want a reasonable quality of the product or the service. On the other hand, you have your shareholders who demand high returns and high profits and high dividends from the organization. Now, if the management of the organization provides value for money, product, or service to its customers, it would have to compromise on the higher profits or dividends. On the same hand, if the organization gives higher profits or dividends to the shareholders, then it would have to compromise on the value for money, product, service for its customers. So in this case, now the organization management would have to decide that which stakeholder needs are more important. And for the rescue, we have something called as the Mendelow's power interest matrix. Okay. So here is the matrix over here. I'll explain it to you. Now it depends on two things. Okay. We need to see the level of power and the level of interest of the stakeholder. Now, level of power is basically how powerful the stakeholder is to influence the company. Okay. If the organization can influence highly on the stakeholder, the level of interest what the stakeholder will have would be high. So it depends on how interested they are in the organization activities. Their interest would be high because the organization can impact them, and how much influence they have on the company. So that's the level of power. Now, if I go back on this diagram, this quadrant over here, you can see that if the level of power and the level of interest is low, so for these type of stakeholders, we have to give them minimal effort. We just have to monitor them that in case if their power changes or their interest changes, the management of the organization might have to change its strategy in that case. So for these stakeholders, the management of the organization won't be wasting too much of time. They will be only monitoring them for any changes in the level of power and in the level of interest. So for them, the strategy would be to give them minimal effort, and let's not waste the organization management time in dealing up with these different stakeholders. But if you see over here, for the key players where the level of power is also high and the level of interest is also high, we call them as key players. And they are important stakeholders, and you have to work very closely with them. You cannot afford to upset these stakeholders because their power to influence the organization is also high, and they are quite interested in what the organization is doing. Hence, we consider them to be as the key players, and the management of the organization has to ensure that you work very closely with them. So those were the two extremes where the level of power and the level of interest is either both high or both low. But if you see that the level of power is high, but the level of interest is low, so for these different type of stakeholders, we have to keep them satisfied. So they can influence the organization, but they are really not interested in how the organization can impact them, like the government. So government can really impact the activities of the organization, but they are not too much interested in what the organization is doing on a day-to-day basis, and there's a very little scope that the organization would be able to impact the government. But in this case, where the level of interest is high, but the power is low, like pressure groups, for example, their interest in the organization activities as to what the organization is doing in terms of environmental protection is quite high, because the organization can impact the environment, hence their interest is high. But on its own, they cannot do quite much about the organization. So the level of power is low. But you need to understand that these types of stakeholders for whom your strategy was to keep informed, they might lobby with these stakeholders who have high power, and hence they become a key player. Okay, so that would be again a problem for the management of the organization. So they don't have to let this lobby happen between those stakeholders which have high interest and low power, and between those stakeholders which have high power but low interest, because in that case again it will become a key player. So for people with high power, stakeholders with high power and low interest, you have to keep them satisfied. For stakeholders who have high level of interest but low level of power, you have to keep them informed. So high power and high interest, we call them as key players, and I explained you that we have to manage them quite closely. For stakeholders who have low power and low interest, we have to give them minimal efforts. You just keep on monitoring for any changes in their level of powers and interest. For stakeholders who have high power, can influence the company quite much, but cannot be influenced by the company, you have to keep them satisfied. For example, the government. If you have low power, the stakeholders have low power, they cannot actually influence the company, but can be influenced by the company, like the environmental pressure groups I talked about. For them, you have to keep them informed as into how the organization is fulfilling their environmental obligations. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please leave them in your comments. I would be happy to answer them.